Hello, good evening. Lovely to see you all and to be here this evening for this event, Living on Water in the World of Stonehenge. This is one of the events that is built around the exhibition at the British Museum, The World of Stonehenge, which is open until the 17th of July, 2022. The exhibition explores the movement and mobility of people, ideas and objects, both before, during and after the time of Stonehenge. So to give you a time period, that's really from the Mesolithic over 10,000 years ago in Britain to the later Bronze Age, around 3,000 years ago. For many visitors to the exhibition to date, one of the most surprising and amazing things about the exhibition is how it shows the connectivity, mobility and travel of the people who lived during this time in this world of Stonehenge. The time period that we're talking about and that our speakers this evening are going to tell you about was a time long before road and rail networks crisscrossed the country, when relatively large areas of Britain were difficult to navigate. They were perhaps still wooded and difficult to pass. So in those times, water, the seaways in particular, Britain being an island, but also the river systems and the wetlands of the country provided really important, rapid ways for people to move around the country and be connected to other communities in different parts of both Britain and indeed continental Europe. And those same wet locations, wetlands and rivers and seaways provided also a rich source of trade and exchange, but also of plants and animal life as a resource for people to live on and with. And as we'll hear tonight, wet and watery places are sometimes considered socially and religiously significant locations. And to take Stonehenge as an example, the River Avon is a really important river connecting monuments within the wider Stonehenge landscape, linking up the famous Stonehenge that we all know with other monuments like Durrington Walls and the recently discovered Blue Stonehenge at West Amesbury. And then later on in the time period we cover after Stonehenge, rivers in particular became a key location where communities deposited offerings and sacrifices and valuable objects in the hope of either communicating with the other world or obtaining something in return for their sacrifice. So rivers play a key role socially and religiously. And I'm delighted tonight that we have three of Britain's top archaeologists to talk about their experiences and their work on some of the most important prehistoric sites that were connected and are connected to and by water, by rivers and by the sea and by wetlands. And so tonight we have Professor Nicky Milner from the University of York, we have Professor Duncan Garrow from the University of Reading, and we have a previous winner of Archaeologist of the Year, Mark Knight from the Cambridge Archaeological Unit. And I'm so delighted that they can join us to talk us through these phenomenal archaeological sites. And first we're going to start with Nicky Milner. And so Nicky, it's over to you to tell us about your research and your work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Neil, for that. And thank you very much for inviting me this evening. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about the Mesolithic site of Carr. This is dating back about 11,000 years ago, but it's a great site to really explore how people lived by and on water at this time. This is a time period really before Stonehenge as we know it existed, but there's lots of evidence for Mesolithic activity in the Stonehenge area at that time. And just to locate us first of all, so the site of Carr is based in the Vale of Pickering, quite near Scarborough and Filey, and at the time was on what is known as Lake Flixton. Also to note at this time that Britain was actually joined to the rest of Europe by a land bridge. So all this white area you can see on this map is a land bridge. And there was probably a big river running right through the middle of this in what is now the North Sea. But you can see all these sites in Denmark and northern Germany are all also early Mesolithic sites dating to about the same time period as Star Carr. And there's lots of connections between the sites, as we'll see a bit later, showing that people moved across this vast landscape and probably along the coast and by rivers. We know that people had boats at this time. So this is what the Vale of Pickering looks like now. It's an agricultural landscape, mainly pasture land. But 11,000 years ago, there was a lake here. And we know this from many, many years of auguring through layers of peat. This is Tim Stradler Hall from UCL. But for many years with the Vale of Pickering Research Trust, boards of students came out and measured the depth of the peat. And this gave us the basal topography, which led us to be able to create this plan of the lake. It's about 4 kilometres across. It's about 2 kilometres north to south. And you can see there are islands on the lake as well. And there's evidence for both Paleolithic and Mesolithic occupation on the islands, again showing people were crossing the water. This is the lake with little red dots on it, which show sites that we found around the lake edge, showing that it's a well-inhabited landscape with late Paleolithic and Mesolithic sites on it, and you can see Star Carr there as well. So the site was first found back in 1948 by a local amateur archaeologist, John Moore, from Scarborough, and then excavated for 3 years by Graham Clark, who was a lecturer at Cambridge at the time, and later became a very well-known professor from Cambridge. You can see these trenches, very deep peat. So peat is an organic material that it's decomposed organics from reeds and other vegetation around the lake. And what's great about peat is that it excludes oxygen, which means that bacteria can't get in and eat away at many of the artifacts that we don't usually find on archaeological sites. So wood and bone and antler. And because of that, we have these incredible artifacts from the site. So here's a headdress, or antler frontlet as it's sometimes known, made out of a red deer skull. It's been carved and the antlers have been modified, and we think that probably people were wearing these on their heads. 21 of these were found by Graham Clark, and we found another 12 since then. And if you have been to the British Museum exhibition, Stonehenge exhibition, you will have seen this right at the beginning of the exhibition, one of these fabulous artifacts. We also have these incredible harpoons or barbed points made out of red deer antlers. And these artifacts are all so rare. I mean, there are no other headdresses in this country. There's only a few others known from northern Germany. And these barbed points from Star Carr constitute about 95% of barbed points known in this country. So really an incredible set of artifacts. We went back to the site in 2004, and I co-directed this site with Chantal Canella from the University of Newcastle and Barry Taylor from the University of Chester. And we actually did 10 years of excavation here, and this is a picture from one of the last few years. You can see that there's still water in the trench. This site still gets sort of waterlogged, helping the preservation of some of these artifacts. And this slide shows the slope down into the waterlogged areas. So the very dark material is the peat, and that's where the water would have been. That's where the lake edge was in the Mesolithic period. And then the higher ground, which is much paler, that sort of beige colour, is where we find the structures where people lived, right on the edge of this lake. And here is one of those structures. This, in fact, is the earliest known house in Britain, believe it or not. It doesn't look particularly exciting just like this, but it is a very important discovery. It's got a hollow in the centre and post holes around it. And in plan, it looks like this. So, you know, you get an impression of what it would have looked like on the ground. But it's very difficult to reconstruct what these structures actually looked like when people were living there, whether they were domed or teepee sort of shape. It was absolutely full of flint, and it had some organic matter in it, which suggests there was sort of bedding and perhaps reeds put down on the floor. But we have to use all these different scientific methods to try and reconstruct what it might have looked like. This is one of our reconstructions. This is in our experimental centre at the University of York. This is a more of a TP type shape. It's thatched with reeds in this case, but it could have been covered in other materials such as maybe animal skins, although it would take a lot of animal skins to cover something like this. And given that it was right by the edge of the lake and there was lots and lots of reeds around the lake, the idea that this is thatched is probably a sensible one. One of the other really intriguing things that we've got from this site are these great wooden platforms. We found 3 of these and a big wooden scatter as well. And hopefully you can see the scale of this. I mean, some of these pieces of wood are, well, they stretch for many meters. Some of them were sort of 4 or 5 meters in length. And some of these are whole trees, but some of these have been split and hewn. And that's really quite remarkable, using the axes and things that they had available to them, things that are quite hard to reconstruct now. This is actually the earliest evidence of carpentry that we've got in Europe. Now, what they're doing on these platforms is, harder to say. There's not a lot of artifacts around them. They're right on the edge of the lake, probably stabilizing the muds. Were they used for jetties for boats, or were they used in ritual practices? We don't really know. We also, though, have this very interesting insight into what people were doing, possibly as kind of ritual practices on the edge of the lake. This is a very, very small bit of archaeology that was left from Clark's excavations. He basically just didn't excavate this very small strip. And in this, you get this remarkable accumulation of material. I mean, I've never seen anything like this on a Mesolithic site. It's bone, antler, flint, wood, all jam-packed together, and thousands and thousands of pieces, including a lot of these headdresses, these antler frontlets. And you can see on this one here that it's actually, there's a couple of small roe deer antlers just next to it as well. So these are very mysterious artifacts. We've got the star Carr one here, and this other one is from northern Germany. And as I mentioned before, we get these sort of connections across this vast area. But northern Germany is the only other place we know where these sort of antler headdresses were found. And again, the interpretation is perhaps that they were used in some kind of ritual practices. So this is taken from ethnography. This is the Evenk tribe in Siberia, where they used headdresses and animal skins and carried out shamanic practices to commune with animal spirits in order to try and ensure a good hunt and try and ensure the prosperity and health of people in the village. And it's thought that maybe these antler headdresses that we find have some kind of similar connections to these. Another really intriguing artifact that was found, again in the shallows of the lake, is this pendant made out of shale. Now, it looks much more robust on this picture, but actually it's very, very thin and it's very small. You can see it's only about 3 centimetres in its biggest dimension. And it's a bit, I mean, it's exactly like a guitar plectrum, actually. And it's got these very little, very extremely small engravings on that are really almost impossible to see with the naked eye, which, you wonder what those are for. And lots of people have given us lots of different sorts of ideas of their interpretations, whether it's for tally marks or some kind of communication or a map or all sorts of ideas like that. But it's intriguing that, again, it was found right in the shallow waters of the lake. And again, we see these connections across this big, vast area. So we have an amber pendant here, which was also found at Star Carr, the one on the grey-black background. And this other amber pendant, which was found in Denmark. And in Denmark, quite a lot of amber pendants like this have been discovered. And you can see, again, they've got these interesting markings on them. They've got these geometric lines, which just look very similar to the Star Carr one with the little tally marks on it. And so, again, we're looking at connections across large areas with people doing similar sorts of things, which is very interesting to think about, and how far these ideas were moving across the landscape. So finally, I just wanted to show this film, a reconstruction by Marcus Abbott of what Star Carr might have looked like 11,000 years ago. I mean, we've seen it looks like agricultural fields now, but from all the work that the scientists have been doing on looking at the environment and the climate and reconstructing the lake, we can begin to build up pictures like this of a very rich landscape full of birds and fish and other animals that people hunted and gathered and fished whilst they were living here. We have these images of this very shallow water beside the edge of the lake, where people would have placed the timbers and placed their different artifacts. And it gives an impression of what it might have looked like. I rather like this, this image where you can really see how shallow it is and how the fish swimming around the different artifacts gives I think a good impression of what all these things are that we've found. In this case here, we've got one of these antler headdresses, but we also have reconstructed what that big accumulation, that jam-packed area of finds might have looked like just under a shallow amount of water. It's such an interesting area, this particular bit, and from the radiocarbon dates, it looks like this particular part of the site could have been accumulated in just 1 year, maybe as many as 60, but it might have been a really short-lived event that meant that people were putting all these artifacts into the water all at the same time. Overall, we know that the site was used for 800 years. And then we have another image here of the timbers on the edge of the lake, and another structure in the background, this time more of a rounded shaped structure. So hopefully that's given you a kind of an idea of what Star Carr might have looked like 11,000 years ago. And if you would like to know more about this site, we do have a website. We have a couple of books which you can get for free from this website, and also we do a Future Learn MOOC, so that you can have it's a free online course if you'd like to know more. So thank you very much.
Wow, thank you so much, Nikki, for that fantastically rich presentation that managed to condense into 15 minutes what I know has been over a decade, if not more, of research and work. So thank you so much for giving us that overview. And for anyone watching, we can all thoroughly recommend those publications, beautifully illustrated and really very accessible for every type of reader. So wonderful achievement. So now we're going to go further north, and we're also going to come forward in time with Duncan Garrow. So Duncan, I'm going to hand over to you for our next talk.
Thanks very much, Neil. So I'm going to be moving us forwards in time, as Neil said, into the Neolithic, around about 5,500 years ago, in the Outer Hebrides, to talk about Neolithic cranog, which is part of a project whose name is Islands of Stone, that I'm involved with, along with Fraser, Sturt and Stephanie Blankshine at Southampton, and Angela Gannon at Historic Environment Scotland, funded by the AHRC. You might be asking, perhaps you are, what is a cranog? And I've put in brackets because I have to be careful making bold claims about this kind of thing today. But it's arguably the best known example of people living on water in Britain and Ireland through prehistory and beyond. You can see a lovely reconstructed cranog from Loch Tay in the image there, and a definition on the screen from a formal definition which explains that a cranog is essentially a nice name for an artificial island, mainly built on lochs or legs, and dating from prehistoric period to the medieval period. There you can see on the screen a map of all the island dwellings in Scotland, and hopefully you can see the densest concentration in the Outer Hebrides, where we're going to be focusing today. I know this is an international audience, so I just wanted to make sure that while I won't be talking about Irish cranogs today, hopefully you can see all of those red dots on the screen just to give you a sense of the fact that this is a broad phenomenon but beyond Scotland, and there are really a lot of crannogs in Ireland, but we've been focusing on Scottish ones mainly ourselves. Going back to that definition, an important element of the crannog is the fact that these have a very wide date range, which you can see in the definition and also in that bar chart down the bottom of the number of known sites of different dates. So you can see spreading from the prehistoric period before 800 BC, as it says there, right through into much more recent centuries closer to today. And the little green bit of that bar is going to be the new sites that we've been working with ourselves. So Neolithic crannogs, where did we get there? The very first potential Neolithic crannog was found in North Uist, and its name is Island Dommel. It was found as a result of the work of Ian Armit, who you can see up on the screen there, based in York, along with Nikki, who we've just been hearing from. And Ian actually went to that site to dig it because he thought it was going to be an Iron Age site, but very quickly realised that it was an Iron Age. It had lots of Neolithic pottery, but uncovered a fantastic sequence of buildings over a course of several years in the 1980s, some of which you can see on the right there. So they've got stone building, the footings of walls, hearths, that kind of thing. Once they'd found that site, everyone was very surprised, and you don't need to read the quotes on the screen here. It's just to make the point that everyone got excited. Everyone was surprised, but then thinking, perhaps there are loads more of these Neolithic crannogs, as you can see in various of the quotes there. But no one actually, after that excavation, found any, until Chris Murray and his colleague Mark Elliott, a local who lives in the Isle of Lewis, where we've been working. Chris is an ex-Royal Navy diver and a man of many talents and curiosities. And Chris was out walking his dog one day around one islet and wondered what it was and whether he might have a little dive and see what he found, knowing obviously that it was a historically interesting site. So Chris got his dusted off his diving gear and went into one of the lochs, and as you can see on the screen there, came out with some fantastically preserved Neolithic pottery. The one in the centre of the screen is what we'd call an Unstone bowl, so dating to around about 5,000 or 6,000 years ago, and very typical of the Outer Hebrides and Orkney. You can see loads more on the photo on the right there, and you can also see from these photos that Chris is a fantastic photographer and has got an eye for the Excalibur-like pot emerging from the loch, which has been a real bonus in terms of the recording of all of what Chris and Mark did. So they then literally went on to Google Earth to find other crannogs that they might investigate. And there you can see our map that we've produced in collaboration with Chris of all of the sites that Chris and sometimes with Mark also dived. And there you can see hopefully the red ones, the dots in red, are the ones on which they found similar quantities of Neolithic material deposited into the lochs around the little crannog. For reasons I won't go into today, I think it's coincidence that those green dots are all in that middle strip. I'm not sure it's meaningful. So just to give you a sense of where we're at, I thought I'd add a crannog onto the English Heritage's timeline of Stonehenge. And you can see the nice red arrow showing where we are. So before the main Stonehenge monument was built, but around the same time that long barrow burial mounds and causewayed enclosure gathering sites were being constructed in that same landscape, but before the henge itself was created. So in terms of where we're at now, in terms of the history of the project, the work that Chris and Mark undertook certainly created new understandings, but also generated more questions, as archaeology so often does. They'd shown that crannogs were 2,500 years older than anyone had previously expected, but they found all this new material, but we don't really know what these sites were for. Quite a lot of the ones that Chris and we have been working on are much smaller than the one I showed you, dug by Ian Armit. They're too small to be settlements. There's lots of material deposited into the locks around them. So we're not quite sure what's going on. It's possible that they were especially created for ritual practices associated with water, as Neil pointed out in the introduction at the beginning, perhaps even burial sites, that kind of thing. But these kind of questions remain to be answered. So since 2016, Fraser and I, and subsequently Steph and Angela, have been working on the sites in collaboration with Chris and others. So what we first did, we went to undertake some survey work. You can see it's quite rudimentary, involving paddling, a rib with some extremely expensive scientific equipment strapped on. These sites are quite inaccessible at times. So we've been able to create bathymetric models of the locks that we've been working on. You can see on the screen there. We've also been able to carry out side scan sonar, and hopefully you can see the kind of blurry image on the screen. The red dots are pottery, but it's basically an image of the loch bed, so you can see individual rocks and things like that, and potentially even sherds of pottery. So amazing resolution images from that boat. But we've also been carrying out diving surveys, as you might imagine. So this is Dan Pascoe showing one of the sherds on the bottom of the loch, and the kind of situation in which you find them, and the amazing preservation that they're in, basically. Here's another nice photo of Felix and Bob emerging with another. It looks similar, but it's a different vessel out of the water. And on the right there, hopefully you can see the two main sites that we've been working on. The cranogs, models of the cranogs, and with the blue line showing where the water is now, and clearly all of the red dots, the pots of the sort that we've just been looking at, deposited into the loch, found on the bottom of the loch and brought up by divers, just as Chris did at the beginning. As well as all of that pottery underwater, we've also been finding the remnants of timber architecture, and hopefully you can see on the screen there some horizontal flat timbers, basically emerging from on the top of the screen there, the edge of the stone architecture of the cranog. We think some of these timbers that were originally upright, vertical, and have subsequently collapsed, so kind of holding the edge of the stone architecture in, potentially. I'll just take you on a quick drone flight to one of the sites to give you a sense of the kind of place that we've been working, the beautiful landscape today that we're lucky enough to be able to spend time in. Always sunny, as I'm sure you can imagine and see on the screen there. Chris flapping his arms around very wildly, but that's just because the film was speeded up. But you can get a sense of the kind of work we're doing. You can see the divers in the water and the beginning of excavation on top. We did carry out an excavation at Langevat. The spoil in bags gives you a real sense of the challenges of working on a small stone island in the middle of a loch, which perhaps we didn't think through before we started. But we've been able to uncover a lot more evidence by digging on land, and moving forwards to last summer, and this is very much an ongoing project, and a different site, but where we undertook a months-long season of field work just in July last year. And there in the image you can see on the right of the screen the stone causeway leading from the nearest edge of the loch out to the stone island, and you can see very clearly our terrestrial trench in brown, and then hopefully you can see on the left of that underwater the underwater trench that was essentially an extension of the on land trench that we created. So we're digging simultaneously underwater and on land on this site, which has been a great experience all round. I'll just give you a quick sequence of the work that we did that masks the very heavy amount of labour involved, including paddling all of that spoil over to the shore in a similar boat to what you just saw. So we took off the vegetation. There's our initial trench. We undertook quite a lot more work, and hopefully you can see that's the end of the initial phase of our work. There's actually a kind of flat area within the middle of the islet, and actually a cairn-like feature that we haven't worked out the purpose of yet. but an interesting feature that we hadn't observed prior to excavation. All of that work and all of that soil removed, on the stone phase, we uncovered 3 pieces of work quartz and no pottery, and you'll have a sense of the kind of material that we got underwater already. So that was really puzzling us this summer. We couldn't work out why there was so little. Could it really only have been deposited off the edge of the islets? Until what we did, hopefully you can see there, is go through the base of the stone architecture. When we dug the trench just there, in the middle of the site, really, we fully expected the stones to continue down, but they didn't. We came straight into some timber and brushwood layers, which was very surprising.
It's like kind of
you can see
prehistoric version of steampunk.
Excavation
in the special frig bag.
You get a real sense of the kind of brushwood that's being excavated. So once we got into those layers, we got loads of quartz and pottery, and lots of Neolithic material culture associated with the pre-stone phase of the monument, with some seemingly some timber layers underneath. Talking of which, I'm going to take you and remind you of where we are, so you can hopefully see the trench that we've just been looking at there. And there's the underwater trench, obviously, and we're going to go down underwater and have a look what was in that trench simultaneously as we were digging those layers. So we're just going down below. You can see the metal framed trench, and hopefully you can see a load of quite substantial timbers underwater in the trench that we've revealed by removing the silts. And in that picture, it's a lot clearer, that central picture. You can see this substantial, essentially small timber construction that seems to have predated the stone architecture of the crannog. And you can see up the top there very clearly the timbers underlying the stones, which we've removed in that little rectangle at the top left. So that was surprising. We were very puzzled about what was going on. But once on this very clear image taken from a drone on a fantastically clear day, you can get a sense of where the trench is, and the fact that those timbers could well extend essentially where these silts are marking out a much bigger area underwater beyond the stones of the crannog. So, as with Chris and Mark's work, our own work has also created new knowledge, new understandings, but more questions, which we hope to be able to resolve in the next couple of years. There seemed to be one or even more than one wooden phase prior to the stone crannog. That wooden architecture extends well beyond the stone islet, and all of the material culture pretty much that we've excavated on land has been associated with that wooden phase. So maybe we're thinking it's likely that the stones were actually much later in date and possibly not Neolithic at all. In all of the phases, the timber and the stone, I'm not sure we're really any closer to understanding what these sites were, what strictly speaking, what they could have been used for, and hopefully further excavation might reveal architectural features that tell us a bit about that question. So just to finish and give you a sense, as I said, it's an ongoing project. So next summer, we're going to be surveying in North Uist, Benbecula and South Uist, you can see in the yellow rectangle, to try and find more Neolithic material in association with crannogs in that part of the world, not just up in Lewis where Chris and Mark had done their work. And then in the summer of 2023, we're going to go back to the site I've just been showing you, and hopefully resolving some of those questions, but no doubt raising some more unanswered ones as well. So do have a look at the website if you'd like to find out more. You can see the address up the top there. And hopefully we'll be explaining the answers to those questions as we move forward. So thank you very much for listening, audience, and thank you, Neil, for inviting me to talk about what is some fantastic sites that I'm very privileged to have worked on.
Wow, thank you, Duncan. I feel like we've all been out onto the crannogs with you through those amazing images and film and finds. So thank you for taking us on that trip from the comfort of our own homes. And we obviously really look forward to seeing what you find in the next couple of years. Definitely a project to keep our eyes on. So now we're going to travel further south. We're going to come down south again, and we're going to move into the later part of the Bronze Age to an extraordinary site that has been covered around the world. And we're going to hand over to its lead excavator, Mark Knight. Mark, it's over to you.
Thank you, Neil. And thank you very much for the invitation to talk about Moss Farm and living on water. In my presentation, I'm going to try and give you sort of three aspects of our project, I suppose. One is the context of the pile dwelling settlement. One is the conditions of living on water. And the third part is the provisioning of that settlement and what that says about the potential of our site in relationship to further discoveries within the context of Fenland and the wetlands of East Anglia. So I'll begin with context and put a map up of the UK. The map on the left is an obscuration map. It basically shows which parts of Britain are deeply buried or covered by sediment that make it difficult for sort of surface inspection like aerial photography and things. And the map on the right is a close-up of Fenland itself. And that shows what you can do with LiDAR, so looking at the sort of micro topography of that landscape. So it goes from being obscure to suddenly into a richly sort of textured landscape. And on that image, you have a little bit of the North Sea at the top. That sort of big white blob is the washes coming in. And on the right-hand side, sorry, the left-hand side of that image, you can see a river coming in through Peterborough, debouching into Fenland itself. And there's a little island there with a sort of fishtail with a blue nose. And that blue nose is the Moss Farm quarry, and that's the location of our excavation. And the important thing I think about beginning with this slide, I suppose, is that sense that this is a deeply buried landscape. There's a lot of sediment in there. And in a way, it sort of becomes another sort of lost world, which we are very fortunate to be the first to sort of properly explore at any sort of scale. So this is a close-up of that same area. So this is what's known as the Flag Fen Basin. So you can see Whittlesea Island, which is the sort of fishtail. You can see Peterborough on the left, which is the big brown blob. And then you can see what is the prehistoric course of the River Nene sort of coming into the deeper basin. And what this image does is it takes away the sediment and shows the paleotopography. And that star is the location of the Flag Fen, sorry, of the Moss Farm pile dwelling settlement. So I work in what's been called a concave shaped landscape with an exaggerated time transgressive environment, which is another word for a negative hydrosphere. But in fact, what it actually means is that it's a big basin that starts off dry and ends up wet. And that succession of sediment, of peat and silt, happens throughout prehistory. So if we wanted to find a site that was contemporary with Nicky's style Carr, we'd have to be at the bottom of that story. For the Neolithic, we have to come up a couple of layers. And for the Roman period, we have to be at the very top. So there's a sense there of a succession. And what's important in that story is that dry to wet sort of story of changing texture is contemporary with the Bronze Age. So the landscapes of Stonehenge would be at the dry end of that spectrum, and the landscape that I'm going to be describing today is at the very wet end of that spectrum. But what's also important about this succession is that sense that it's not a day-night sort of transformation from dry to wet. It's something that happens over time. And that movement from damp to sodden to prone to flooded to drowned is a landscape that's occupied. And there are earlier sort of iterations of people trying to engage with the wetlands and building on there. So our site, the Moss Farm pile dwelling settlement, doesn't arrive in a sort of out of a void. It actually comes from a sort of a history of people building timber edifices within those sediments. So here's an aerial view of Fenland, and the first thing you notice is how flat it is. The second thing is the rich black colour of the surface peat. But most importantly, from my perspective, is also you can see it's not just the land that becomes dry, but also the rivers. And this sort of S shape or sinuous shape running through in pale colours is the paleo channel of the Nene, and it's the channel that we've been investigating in the context of the pile dwelling settlement. We're very lucky that we work in the biggest hole in Finland, which is the Musfarm quarry, where they extract clay to make bricks. And what that does is it enables us to go deep without being underwater and basically explore these deep sediments in a sort of safe environment, but also at scale. And the great thing about this image is that the two characters you can see at the bottom have basically stood up of a Mesolithic buried soil. But the feature of our interest is that big dark smile at the sort of far end on the right-hand side of the image, which is the Musfarm Paleo Channel. And in 2009, 10, 12, 11 and 12, we were able to excavate it at scale. So we dug over 350 meters of the Paleo Channel in its entirety. And if you look closely at this image, you can see these sort of strips of blue plastic, which are covering up fish traps and fish weirs and log boats sitting in within that Paleo Channel. And here's just an example of some of the preserved waterlogged artifacts from that sequence. And this is a really nice image in that sense that we can see that we were basically digging a channel that was pretty much preserved in its entirety. There was no truncation of it. And we were able to see in articulation fish traps and fish weirs and log boats and metalwork, all pretty much where it was deposited. So here's some of the fish weirs running along its base, and one of the 24 fish traps that were distributed even along its length. And I suppose what I'm trying to show here is that the Paleo Channel has this long history of activity. It's already a busy place long before the pole dwelling settlement was actually constructed. So here's our Paleo Channel. It's a bit like our landscape in a sense that it's a concave shape that fills up the sediment. So it begins at 1600 BC and ends at 100 BC. So most of the fish weirs and fish traps are at its base, and the log boats occur throughout its succession, and our settlement is up in the sort of top third of that sequence. And the other thing to say about our Paleo Channel is that it's undynamic. There's nothing being eroded. It's almost like a linear lake, and sediment is forming very slowly and basically preserving things in situ. So there's a real sense here of what we find is in its real place. So this is the same sediment, but this is our excavations in 2015 of the pole dwelling settlement. So the same grey silt that surrounded the boats and the fish traps covering our architecture. You can also get a sense of our methodology. Spend a lot of our time laying flat on our chest, basically dangling down and digging with our fingertips. And this is the site in its entirety. So we put a big shed up over the top of the excavation. And for practically 12 months, this was our home of excavating the settlement. So on the right-hand side of this image is the southern bank of the channel, and on the left-hand side is the center of the channel. So you're seeing sort of half the settlement or half the channel, and you're seeing the remains of the collapsed settlement. So you can see a line of posts, which is a sort of palisade that enclose it, the settlement, and in the center you can see these sort of roof fans of basically the collapsed structures. And this is what it looks like in plan. So this big white rectangle in effect is the limit of our excavation. And you get this sense of all these collapsed elements of superstructure and the roof fans and also the line of the palisade. And the other thing to say about the settlement is that it was destroyed by fire. So the majority of the horizontal structural timbers, the superstructure, were charred. Whereas the footings or foundations of the settlement, which were the piles and the uprights, were preserved by being waterlogged. So we've got this sort of underwater preserved footprint, and then we've got this superstructure that's come down through the conflagration event. And in total, we found 5 structures that we were able to identify, but undoubtedly there were more that were truncated to the north from the former quarry. And this is a sort of reconstruction of the whole settlement as we sort of envisage it within the channel. So it's a series of circular structures built on stilts with a surrounding palisade, built in water, but also a river that was actually set within a wetland environment itself. So we are completely divorced from land. And this is a reconstruction of the sort of elevation. So to focus on our sort of reconstruction, the great thing is that in that sort of collapse of those structures, if you can imagine a sort of a coffee pot and basically have the plunger coming down, the roof acted like that. So all the weight of the turf and the thatch and the clay on the roof and these heavy rafters, as the settlement burnt down, it dropped and basically hit the floor and took the floor into the bottom of the channel. So we ended up with this sort of compressed or conflated version of the original architectural superstructure. You can see on this slide also one of the piles being driven deep into the riverbed. So this is structure one in its entirety as we excavated. And if I just sort of highlight that, you can see that we've got concentric circles of uprights. So in blue in the outer ring and green on the inner ring. And then also you can see the red of the palisade, the sort of an accompanying walkway to the right-hand side of the structure. And then if I highlight the roof rafters, you can see the configuration of the structure. And the thing to say about this is that this is a roundhouse on stilts. It's 8 meters in diameter. And to all intents and purposes, is a replica of all the roundhouses we find on less well-preserved sites, on the sort of uplands or terrestrial sites throughout the whole of southern Britain. Now, what's different about our structure is that obviously that we've still got the architecture present, but also we can take the roof off and go inside the buildings themselves. So in here, you actually get an indication of that preservation. So you can see the robust timbers of the roof rafters, but also if you look inside the excavated quarters, you can see the much smaller diameter work of the wattle floors. And also you can see to the right-hand side of the slide, all the wood chips of construction. And what this slide demonstrates is that there's a conflation here of construction. And when we did the dendrochronology of the timbers, we found that all of the uprights, whether it's the palisade or the roundhouses, and all of the major timbers that formed the roof rafters and the floor joists were all felled in the same year. And our dendrochronologists also told us that when he looked at the detail of the tree rings, that the wood was green when it caught fire. There was a certain distortion about those growth rings. So his suggestion is that our settlement was built as one and burnt down as one, and perhaps within as little as 12 months. And that seems to be reflected in that lack of stratigraphy. We just have a single layer, basically expressing all of the time of the settlement. The other thing to say about the architecture is that basically there's very little conversion going on. Most of the wood is in the round. If it is converted, it tends to be just split. And it's a sort of there's a real sort of sense of particular types of wood being used for particular types of the architecture. So there's a real sense here that this wasn't something that was ad hoc or sort of off the cuff construction, but was something that was well practiced or well versed. So I built the structures now. I've given you their context within the Fenland environment, within the river and things. And now I want to go a little bit closer at the actual conditions of the settlement, the people that were living there, what they were experiencing. So from the sort of macroscopic to the microscopic, looking at things like the pollen and the chironomids or midges and the algae that we found within our samples and things, everything points to this being basically still water, heavily vegetated, but basically it is wet. There's no ambiguity about that at all. And that the deposition of our settlement was basically falling into river sediment. So the upper part of this slide shows the mass of charred wood and turf and pots and wooden artifacts and things. And the lower part of the slide shows that 15 centimeters of stratigraphy that represents the entirety of construction, occupation and destruction. And we were very fortunate in the sense that our river context was so sort of stagnant that things pretty much where they fell was where they stayed. So there was a real reflection of basically what was once superstructure and how that plan worked in the depositional environment. So beneath the footprints of the buildings, we were finding whole pots, wooden troughs in relative real distribution. And then around the sort of fringes or halos of the structures, we were finding these formative middens, which was basically the broken potsherds, butchered animal bones, burnt stones being deposited during the lifetime of the settlement. And we call them formative because they are one, they are very thin, and two, that there's that relationship again to the wood chips of construction. You can see that the bone sits directly on top of the construction debris. So here's a plan, rather than showing all of the architecture, this is all the material culture and faunal remains. So you can see that there's a sort of relationship between the distribution of things and the distribution of the footprints of the individual buildings. And one of the things that we found a lot of within the settlement were coprolites, poos, basically belonging to different inhabitants of the settlement. So on here you can see charred land droppings, but also on the top right-hand side you can see these preserved waterlogged coprolites from dogs and from humans. These are basically the inhabitants of the structures excreting over the side of the structures into that watery context to join the potsherds and the animal bones. And the nice thing about this side of the story is that there's a distribution pattern that has the same sort of assurance, or gives us the confidence that we're actually seeing live pattern. So inside several of the structures we found articulated lands, and next to those we found charred land droppings. Whereas the dog and human poos basically are occurring outside the structures, they're being deposited into those formative middens. There's a real sense here of the way that space was being used, but also a sort of sense of hygiene. But equally, there's this relationship to that watery context, and the examination of the sediment beneath the structure showed that there was a lot of sort of poo or fecal matter in amongst that sediment, but also within the coprolites themselves, we were able to identify parasites. And a lot of those parasites were basically aquatic in origin. So they were things like fish tapeworm. And there's this indication that basically occupants were eating fish and then defecating into the paleo channel and then catching fish and eating those. And there's this sort of circulation of the eternal ecology of the guts of our inhabitants were basically full of aquatic parasites. And at the same time, what's really interesting is that what's absent from that is that there are none of the sort of familiar terrestrial indicators and things. So we weren't seeing things like roundworm and stuff like that. And what our parasite experts are telling us is that if our inhabitants spent any time on land, they would have those roundworms. So they're not just here seasonally, they are full-time occupants of this watery environment. So I'm going to finish off giving you a context of conditions and to actually move on to provisions and things. And I think in a way, this is the sort of biggest demonstration about how sort of successful they are in this context above water. But also there's the sort of implications of our settlement in terms of our understanding of what's going on in the late Bronze Age elsewhere. So back to our distribution of material culture and that sort of relationship between pottery and animal bones and the structures and things. I'm going to give you a sort of whistle-stop tour through some of the things that were coming out in relationship to the building. So things like the pottery, from tiny little cups to bowls to storage jars, and then things like wooden artifacts, so hafted axes, almost certainly used in the construction of the settlement, but also during the lifetime of it, but also with this little wooden buckets and wooden troughs. And obviously the hafted objects themselves, so the bronze metalwork, so axes and sickles and razors and spears. Then in addition to that, the real sort of surprise, I suppose, but a benefit of the sort of benign water environment of the context of our burnt down settlement were all these charred textiles. These are plant fibers, so things like bobbins with spun yarn on them, fragments of charred textiles. And what was really impressive was that there's sort of 30 of these plant fiber bundles. These are basically in the middle of being processed, but they've yet to be spun. So all stages of textile production were present within our structures. And then from the sort of mundane or the familiar, I suppose, to the exotic. So things like amber beads and glass beads. And some of the glass beads have an origin in the sort of Eastern Mediterranean, maybe as far as Iran, and they're being being manufactured in the middle of the 9th century BC, and our occupants are wearing them as necklaces. So to sort of finish off with, I suppose, is that sense of sort of deposition and a relationship between the material culture and the sort of that year's worth of settlement. The animal bone had the ability to be refitted, and we could put bits back together again. So whether it's the articulated lambs or its actual meat joints, so sort of hindquarters of wild boar and red deer. And similarly, we could do the same with the pottery. So we could look at all the pottery that was deposited within the middens and return it back to its original structures. So the refitting exercise allowed us to turn potsherds into whole vessels and then to locate them with individual buildings within the settlement. And it was those pathways that we used also to return the meat joints as well. And from that, we were able to create these sort of inventories or household sort of sets within the settlement itself. And as I start to go through those materials, you'll see that there's a real sense here of patterning. So we have the metalwork, the wooden vessels, the buckets, the troughs, the spindle whirls and loom weights, the quern stones, seed caches, the necklaces, and then finally the lambs and the lamb droppings. You get a sense of each structure having a very similar pattern of materials, but also this sort of right-hand-sidedness of the spaces themselves, so the sort of difference between the living spaces and maybe the sleeping spaces. And from that, we're able to create these sort of inventories. So each one of these columns is a single structure, and within that you can see the presence of, everyone's got an axe or a gouge or a sickle or a pot and things. So a real sense here of the living assemblage, basically, within individual structures. So this is the Musk Farm Parr dwelling. I've given you in its watery context. There's no ambiguity about that. They are living on water, and there's a real sense that they were well provided. And there's a real sense here that they have a connection with dry land in terms of some of the things they're eating, but they are pretty much their foundation, their footprint is in that watery context. And if we go inside structure one and have this, look at this reconstruction by Judith Dobie, the sort of sense of the sort of busyness or the clutter of that space, but remind ourselves that they're not living in a roundhouse on land, but they're above water on those sort of springing floors and things. And I think there's a real sort of ambition here that they don't expect that the place is about to be burnt down. These are people that are wanting to be living here for the future. And this, in a way, alongside that sort of well-versed architecture, suggests that this is one of many of these types of settlements out in the deep fens, and we were lucky enough to find one of them. So I'll finish with a sort of a slide of that story, I suppose, of that negative hydrosphere, that time transgressive landscape. Whereas perhaps at the beginning of our story, where people are trying to get across those wet spaces by building causeways, but by the end of our story, they're basically living on a river and they're occupying those wet spaces. So it goes back, I suppose, what Neil said at the beginning, that sense of connectivity. So as the rivers become sort of dislocated, people actually move onto those networks so that they can remain connected to that broader network. And with that, I'll say thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Mark, for taking us into what you poetically described as a lost world. And I think we'll all agree that it's also an incredibly rich world. We saw how this period is not just about stone and metal and bone, but you showed us how it's also about wood and pottery and all the objects that surrounded people, how rich their lives were. We often don't see that in archaeological sites. So thank you for that window into a really remarkable archaeological site, and a window into what it was like to live on water 3,000 years ago. So thank you. And really to draw the three sites together, I wonder if we could, if I could ask our three speakers to think a little bit about a tension, an opposition that's been evident throughout the three papers. And that's one of really the ritual and perhaps ceremonial and religious ideas, which archaeologists love, of course, that might influence why people wanted to either live or work or put objects into watery locations, versus some of the more practical, down-to-earth reasons why it would be useful and economically beneficial to live near this amazing resource of wetland or watery landscapes. So I wonder if I could start at the beginning with our first presenter, Nikki, and ask her if she has any thoughts on that tension between the ritual and the everyday at Star Carr.
Thank you, Neil. Yes, I mean, I think it is really interesting to think about this, and and some of the things that you're uncovering, we're interested in questions about what animals were available in the landscape, what animals did people eat and use their bones for tools and things like that, and building up a picture of the environment. But we're also faced with these artifacts which clearly aren't just absolutely necessary for survival. They're, the headdresses and the pendant. Clearly people are making things which have other aspects to their lives, and as archaeologists we often talk about ritual, but I think some of these things were probably very much intertwined into everyday life. And we're certainly faced with difficulties when trying to interpret something like Clark's area, that big jam-packed area of bone and antler and wood and so on, with the antler frontlets and the pendant in there. You know, is this just a midden where people are dumping things, or is this some kind of ritual activity where people have placed these things purposefully in the water, perhaps over a very, very short period of time? And these are the questions that we face all the time when we're excavating amazing sites like this. You know, what do those sorts of things actually mean, or what do they represent for the people in the, carrying out those activities?
Thank you for that insight. And I wonder if we could go to Duncan now. He's already told us about a kind of Excalibur moment with the pot, which certainly gives it a ritual ceremonial sense to the deposits there. Is that how you see some of these deposits in the Neolithic, Duncan, as religious or ritual offerings?
Yeah, it's a really interesting topic to explore because I think over the course of our project, we've sort of swung around between these different understandings of these sites. And we started off going out there thinking they were much more likely to be more towards the domestic side, and the more work we've carried out on them, the more puzzled we've been about what's going on. And so to have sort of swung slightly in the direction of the more ceremonial role for these sites. And intriguingly, now we've got this timber and stone phases. I wonder whether potentially the site might even transform its usage, and that in itself indicates that perhaps our own terms of understanding things as functional or ceremonial is not adequate to understand the way in which prehistoric people thought about their world and about the locations in which they occupied. So it's an ongoing challenge. We'll see.
That's great, and I wonder if that's a neat segue to Mark, because with Must Farm, with that incredibly rich site, you almost wonder, we're into a sort of an archaeology or a prehistory of a type that we've never seen before in this country, where it's so rich that tendency that I certainly suffer from to want to see religious or special meaning. Perhaps, Mark, is it fair to say that the richness of the site at Must Farm is such that you're surrounded by everyday life? You don't need to compartmentalize this sort of social, religious, and the everyday. Is that taking it too far?
No, not at all. I think it's funny, isn't it? Because when we first started excavating the site, and there was this understanding that the sort of material intensity that was present, there was that sort of temptation to see the site as exceptional, and therefore it was too much for it to be, I don't know, a domestic site. It had to be something special, and therefore it sort of left the context and became this sort of, story of some grand gesture, some theatre, some display, or something like that. And yet, the more we excavated it, the more we were able to articulate the sort of relationship between the architecture and its sort of familiarity, the roundhouses and things, and also the sort of the deposition and the coherency of the material culture, these sort of sets of cups and bowls and jars and things and metalwork and stuff like that. There was a real sense there of I don't know, the familiar, I suppose. It felt like a living space that we might be able to occupy and things. So there was that, I suppose. And I suppose the other side to our story was always that we were very fortunate to be able to dig this river in a very sort of structured way, and actually to see things in relationship to each other. Whereas more often what happens to rivers is that their Bronze Age content is brought up in a dredger, it's brought up in a bucket, it's machined out sort of thing, and there's a sense we just see the objects in isolation. And because of that sort of history of metalwork and rivers, and here I'm thinking of the Thames and things, there was this sort of straightforward sort of relationship between metalwork equals watery deposition, and therefore it's about the sort of ritual aspect of life and things. So I feel like in a way that maybe our circumstance, our methodology has sort of swung us towards this sort of mundane, this sort of familiar sort of world and things. And maybe I'm in danger of missing out on some of the more sort of, I don't know, esoteric side of deposition.
Well, it's certainly a great counterbalance to have, and I think we can all agree that the sites we've seen, that the rich survival of organics means that these are sites that provide one of the most important windows into the time before, during, and after what we call the world of Stonehenge in the exhibition. So I'm really grateful for giving us those insights. And before we go to the Q&A and answer questions from you, it's time now to say thank you and goodbye to Professor Nikki Milner, who has a previous appointment that she's got to attend. But I just want to say on behalf of the British Museum, thank you to Nikki for a wonderful presentation on the finds and work done at Carr. So thank you, Nikki, and look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you so much. And yeah, sorry I have to go. It's been amazing to hear about these other incredible sites and to enjoy the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Well, Nikki's left us now, but we have a number of questions from the audience this evening to ask to Duncan and to Mark. So if I can start with some questions to Duncan Garrow. Jane Selwood has asked, what was the loch water level like around the crannogs that you excavated during the Neolithic period? Was it much the same as it is today?
That is a very good question, and one that we're actually needing to answer ourselves. Which hopefully we will be able to do as we analyse the loch bed sediments and things like that as through time over the next couple of years. But at the moment we don't exactly know, but we have a sense that it's roughly the same as today. One of the things you can actually gauge it by is the fact that the stone causeway is slightly under the surface of the water at the moment, so you suspect that the loch was a bit lower, but perhaps not loads lower, basically. But yeah, it's a great question and something we need to resolve ourselves. Great,
thanks, Duncan. And then another question to you from Jenny Keeney. She's asked, is there evidence of fires, I suppose, of hearths or of any type of fire being lit on the crannog sites that you've excavated?
Yeah, also a very, very good and pertinent question. So on both of the ones that we've dug, we have had evidence of burning, which dates to the Middle Bronze Age, so around about 1400 BC, so a couple of thousand years after the sites were first constructed, potentially in approximate association with the stone phase of the main site I showed you. I suspect you're maybe asking it about whether it's to do with cremation. I'm not sure, or perhaps just general living, and we don't know because bone doesn't survive. So, which is a little bit frustrating. But they are doing burning, but in later phases of the site's use, the slightly mysterious phases that I didn't go into detail in because of that mysteriousness. But good question.
And a third question to you before I move on to Mark, Duncan. From Anthony Reddington, he's asked, is there any dating that you've been able to get from the wood that you were showing in your presentation? And what's that told you?
Yeah, so also a great question. And the answer is yes. And as it happens, literally yesterday, we got another set of radiocarbon dates back from the material we were excavating in the summer. And in short, that all of the crannogs that we've been able to date appear to have been built and used in a pretty narrow window of about a century, from about 3,500 to 3,400 BC. Wood gives you great radiocarbon dating, and this again is something that we'll be working more on over the next couple of years as we dig more, but also as we understand things and have questions that we want to answer through that dating. But yeah,
great. Thank you, Duncan. Mark, we've got questions for you as well. Lloyd Clements has asked about the comparison between sites like Muss Farm and those lake dwellings that we know of from continental Europe, from Switzerland and Germany and places like that. Are they the same sort of thing? Are there big differences between them?
I suppose the first difference we can make is that our architecture is round, it's circular, whereas the sort of continental equivalents, the majority of the architecture there is rectangular. So I think in a way, when we first excavated our site, we half expected it to be made up of rectangular structures, and it turned out to be that sort of ubiquitous roundhouse. So that's a major difference. And I suppose one other thing to say is that the lake dwellings of Central Europe are famous for their deep stratigraphy, their time scales, this sense of lamination and deposition and things, and trying to break that down, whereas our site has that single layer, that sort of 1 year's worth of deposition.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. And then there's a question about, this is from Sally Wilkins. She's asked about the reasons for the abandonment of Moss Farm. I think perhaps we might expand on that in terms of the burning episode. What do you know about it? What's the latest thinking on the burning of the houses?
I suppose the one thing is that it's comprehensive, and two, it has a focus, or perhaps even two focuses in its beginning of things. So it feels like it feels like there's something deliberate about it. Now, when we say that, that could be the occupants burning down their own settlement as some sort of end gesture, or it could be people who basically have chased the occupants out and burnt the settlement down. But it is comprehensive, and there's that real sense that everything's left behind. So there's an immediacy about that as well, I think. So I suppose in a way it's down to the interpreter to come up with a sort of choice of which of those scenarios fits best with the story. But what is evident is that the occupants themselves weren't present at the time of the fire. We don't have any charred human remains to go with the rest of that sort of rich arrangement of materials. So.
Great. We're running out of time, and there's so many great questions. And I'm going to cut to the next question, which is from Dorian Gray, who asks about why people chose to live on water, given the challenges of that. And I think that's probably a good question for you, Mark. What are the pros and cons in a short answer?
Well, I think it goes back to something you said right at the very beginning, which is this sort of connectivity. Is that in the Fens, if you want to be near the rivers, you need to live on the water because they get so dislocated from land. So it's that sort of connection being maintained, I think.
Great, that's very succinct, thank you. And then a question about the pottery from Moss Farm. Do we know where it's coming from? Are the imports? Is it locally made? That's a question from Niels Nielsen.
The petrology says that they're locally made. So, and the other thing to say about them very quickly is that there appears to be very few hands in the manufacture. It's almost as if it's one potter that's produced all those vessels.
Super, thank you very much. So we're down to the last minute or so, and I think it's probably good to wrap up there and thank everyone for their questions. I know there were questions for Nikki, and unfortunately she couldn't be with us to answer them. I really recommend her research, publications, very comprehensive and many answers in those books that are freely available. But it's just sort of for me to say that the next event is on the 7th of April at 5:30 UK time, the same time as this evening's lecture, and this evening's seminar, and it's called Connections Across Britain and Ireland During the Age of Stonehenge, and that's a wonderful panel of Seren Griffith, Nick Carr and Josh Pollard, and they'll be looking at Neolithic connections across Britain and Ireland during the time of Stonehenge. And then finally, just to say that the exhibition, The World of Stonehenge, is open now, and it's going to be open until the 17th of July. So I really hope some of you can come and see the exhibition as well. And I'll just end by thanking both Duncan Garrow and Mark Knight for their contributions this evening, and to all of you for your questions and for being with us this evening. So thank you very much, and have a lovely evening.
Thank you.